Juneteenth. Juneteenth is America's celebration of its delayed sign and close. If you're an American citizen, I'm going to explain why this is a day of celebration for you, regardless of your race or ethnicity. And if you're a deal nerd or someone who's interested in corporate transactions and business combinations, then you should appreciate this day too. Hi, I'm Denzel Cadet, the managing member of Cadet Legal, a corporate transactional and IP focused boutique. And this is Watch the Ops, our show that explores business opportunities and real operating businesses. This is a special Juneteenth episode of the show, but we're still talking business deals. We're still talking operations and business opportunities. If you want to understand deal making, if you want to understand business combinations, a fundamental distinction exists between various points of signing and agreeing and ultimately closing the transaction. I'll say that again. There is a difference that you need to understand between signing as part of a transaction and actually closing the transaction, where consideration is actually exchanged, payment is exchanged, assets are transferred, ownership title is transferred. That's not the same thing as signing an agreement. That is a fundamental concept for you to understand if you are a business buyer. If you're going out and searching for lower middle market businesses, whether they're HVAC or consumer or professional services, this principle will protect you and help you to better perform your search because you'll know not to get too attached to any one deal. Just with signing an LOI, you have an agreement to agree, but you still have multiple things that you have to work out, including doing diligence, both financial, legal, and operational diligence on your target. Shout out to Elliott Holland and Guardian Due Diligence. You also have to enter into the definitive agreements, usually a purchase agreement and various supporting documents that make this transaction actually happen. So signing the LOI, while it's an important moment and a moment to celebrate, is not actually closing a deal. Similarly, even when you have the definitive agreements, that purchase agreement, you need to understand whether this purchase agreement, this transaction is structured as a simultaneous sign and close or as a sign and then close. There's a difference. As a corporate attorney, many of us, and myself included, generally prefer that your deal is structured as a simultaneous sign and close. What that means is the day that you exchange signature pages to your purchase agreement and the other transaction documents is also the same day, the same moment where you exchange the consideration, the cash compensation, the promissory note, the shares if there's an equity rollover. All of those happen at essentially the same moment in time. We prefer that because we know that the day that we sign, everything that needs to be done happens and ownership has actually transferred. The combination of these two parties has actually occurred. We don't just have a signed piece of paper. That is not the only way that transactions can be structured. And although it's the way that I prefer my buyers and sellers to structure their deals, I have been part of deals where there's been a signing of definitive agreements, but the actual closing, the consummation of the transaction doesn't occur until certain other conditions are met. What are things that may delay closing after you sign a deal? Generally speaking, you're thinking about financing. So the buyer needs time to go and secure its financing, whether that's debt or equity. Again, you can see why in most deals, we prefer that a person has their financing lined up and in hand before we sign. But there are occasions, and I've been on deals, particularly where I was sell side, where we signed definitive agreements and part of the conditions to close were the buyer obtaining financing. And in that deal, the buyer did not get financing and the deal fell through. Very practical example of why we don't love staggering signing and close. Another condition that may need to be met in between signing and closing is consents or governmental approvals. Consents may be something as simple as a landlord consent to transferring a lease or a major customer or supplier consent. I've seen deals be derailed where the consent of a big government contract customer was not obtained, and that customer actually had a right to cancel the contract, to terminate it if there was a change of control. So consents are important, whether it's a landlord or private commercial partner to a contract or a government approval, local consent, depending on the type of transaction. You may need approval of a specific regulatory body. You may need to obtain certain licenses. In some of our trades and home services deals, plumbing company, tree cutting and landscaping company, the buyer needed to obtain or provide for their licensure to actually perform in that business as a closing condition. In the bigger cap context, we see that signing a deal doesn't mean that you're going to close until you get all the necessary approvals. A big recent example of this is Paramount Skydance proposed acquisition of WB Discovery. Now, whenever you have big deals, and when I say big, I don't mean lower middle market, I mean big cap. There are certain thresholds of deal size or party size or being in an industry that's particularly sensitive, think defense or certain deep tech, that require you to get approvals from the government before you can proceed. One of those areas where you might need approval is antitrust, HSR. In the case of the Paramount acquisition of WB Discovery, the sheer size of the parties and the transaction, $110 billion, triggered antitrust review by the federal government. Just so you know, the basic thresholds for antitrust HSR review are 133 million transaction size. That's the basic rule. So here we have $110 billion. Of course, this definitely triggered review. Another threshold, if the overall size is over 530 million or so dollars, that's another threshold. Doesn't matter here. For your purposes, just understand as you start to get out of the lower middle market to bigger deals, you may have antitrust consents and approvals that you need to obtain. And when you're talking about something as big as the Paramount Skydance acquisition of WB Discovery, the size alone, $110 billion, way exceeds the threshold. And the fact that they're in the same industry and have the potential to really disadvantage consumers is why this underwent antitrust review. Well, the Department of Justice, although it did not approve Netflix's proposed acquisition of WB, which is interesting given the recent rivalries and competition between Netflix and Paramount for spectacle MMA cards, and the fact that the Trump administration is friendly with one side, the Paramount UFC side, and maybe not so much with the Netflix side. Interesting coincidence. But anyway, Paramount, the deal was approved by the DOJ, but now certain states, California, New York, or others, are gearing up to challenge this transaction, to not let this deal that was signed get closed based on antitrust concerns. So if you are interested in deals, understand that signing, whether it's the LOI, whether it's a definitive agreement, those are big, important steps, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've actually closed on your acquisition, on your business combination. What does that have to do with America and Juneteenth? Well, government in general and the American social experiment specifically has often been described, and I think accurately, as a social contract. The nation, the concept of the nation, similarly, it's not a concrete thing like a state or like a government that's set up by rules and structures and laws. The nation is a conceptual idea about who belongs and who doesn't. Think of the Benedict Anderson Imagine Community writing. When you think of the nation, it's really about agreement as well. Who we are as a country, who we are as an identity, who belongs and doesn't belong. It exists only as an agreement between us. Similarly, our government, how we're run, the rights that the various members of our nation have are governed by contracts and agreements, literal written contracts and agreements. When you think of the United States, the Union, it was a merger. It was a combination of separate entities. Although there were various key signing moments throughout its history, think about the Declaration of Independence. Think about the Constitution. Think about the Emancipation Proclamation and various other huge agreements that were signed that we celebrate. You have to realize that each one of these things that I just named, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation at the tail end of the Civil War, all of these things were signing moments in America's contract, signing moments in America's merger, in America's union. They were not closing moments. And the reason that these were not closing moments for America's union is because of the reasons that we point out. Smaller deals get delayed. We didn't properly, through diligence, understand what assets were important and which weren't, what risks were there and which weren't. We also didn't get all the consents and approvals of all the relevant stakeholders. What do I mean? With the Declaration of Independence, let's think of it as an LOI. It was a declaration of our intent, our ideals as a country, as a nation. Just like an LOI, a letter of intent, it is a declaration of your intentions to combine to form something new. You still have to actually execute the transaction and join the multiple parties together. That's what happened through the Revolutionary War and through the negotiation and signing of the Constitution. However, we realized that our diligence was incomplete, that we were improperly weighting both the assets and the parties to this union. We had in our original Constitution that Black people were 3/5 of a person, that they weren't even full value as a person, that they were property. Black people were included as assets in the transaction rather as stakeholders, or better yet, as stockholders, parties to the transaction. And that was one of the early mistakes that kept us from actually consummating America as it was promised, based on the principles of the LOI, the Declaration of Independence. So we fought an American Civil War, and that represents, again, something that is common in deals, which is you have parties to a transaction who realize there are still big fundamental issues of disagreement, fundamental issues about what should be included in the deal or how they should be priced, or an unwillingness to give up certain rights. That's what happened in the American Civil War. You had the South, the Confederacy, and the North, the Union, arguing over a fundamental term, a fundamental condition of the American combination, the American Union. Namely, were we going to allow ownership and trading of human beings as part of our structure? And was, as we expand into new markets, was slavery going to be a part of it? To the South, this was a no-brainer deal term. Of course we get to keep our slavery. To the North, they were pushing back. And again, a lot of it is, even for Northerners who were okay with slavery in general, it was an issue of power. As we expand, would these new states be slave states or free states? So the Civil War really represented, again, it was a bloody moment in American history with a lot of lives lost. But if you look at it from the standpoint of this union, it was a point of contention, a sticking point in the deal that had to be sorted out, where the parties were not on the same page. The union obviously won that debate, and slavery was abolished. The Emancipation Proclamation was declared. However, this still represented a signing moment, important, but not closing the deal. And that is the reason that we have Juneteenth today. Because although the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, slavery still existed in the United States formally as late as 1865 in Texas, where in June of 1865, the military came in to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation and to hold all the parties to this American Union, this American combination, accountable to all the closing conditions of the deal. Although America has a lot of important signing moments that we should celebrate, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, the signing of the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the end of the Civil War, all of these things were signing moments. And if there was a close, it did not happen until Juneteenth. Lastly, just because a deal is closed, just because the combination has been consummated, doesn't mean that it's a done deal. Many times with transactions, there are post-closing covenants, agreements to do things after close. Those things are not suggestions, are not soft wishes. No, they are binding agreements, binding promises that are part of the deal. And so even if we consider Juneteenth as the closing date of this United States of America, there are still post-closing covenants, covenants about how the various parties are going to be treated, what rights they have, and what benefits they enjoy that still haven't been enforced. And that's why various parties, various stakeholders and stockholders in the United States are still arguing for their rights. Happy Juneteenth to all who celebrate. I hope after this video, that's more of you. Remember, whether it's culture, whether it's history, sports and entertainment, as experienced corporate transactional attorneys and business advisors, we are always watching the ops.